Oba Chandler was an American serial unaliver and mass unaliver who was convicted and executed for the June 1989 unalivings of Joan Rogers and her two daughters, whose bodies were found floating in Tampa Bay, Florida, with their hands and feet bound. Autopsies showed that they had been thrown into the water while still alive, with ropes tied to a concrete block around their necks. The case became high profile in 1992 when local police posted billboards bearing enlarged images of the suspect's handwriting recovered from a pamphlet in their car. Chandler was identified as the unaliver and his neighbour recognised his handwriting. Prior to his arrest, Chandler worked as an unlicensed aluminium siding contractor. Against the advice of his attorneys, he testified in his own defence, saying that he had met the women and had given them directions. He said that he never saw them again except in newspaper coverage and on the billboard set up by authorities. Police originally theorised that two men were involved in the unalivings, but this was discounted once Chandler was arrested. Following his conviction, Chandler was incarcerated at Union Correctional Institution. During his 17 years of incarceration until his execution, he didn't have a single visitor. He was executed on the 15th of November 2011. He wrote a last statement to prison officials. The statement was read at a post-execution news conference. In February 2014, DNA evidence identified Chandler as the unaliver of Ivelisse Berrios Bergeris, who was found unalive in Coral Springs, Florida on the 27th of November 1990. Chandler, born on the 11th of October 1946, and the fourth of five children to Oba Chandler Sr. and Margaret Johnson, was raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. When he was 10 years old, in June 1957, his father hung himself in the basement of his family's apartment. At the funeral, Chandler jumped into his father's open grave as the gravediggers were covering the coffin with dirt. Between May and September 1991, concurrent with the police investigation of the Rogers family triple unaliving, Chandler was an informant for the U.S. Customs Bureau's Tampa office. When Chandler was 14, he began stealing cars and was arrested 20 times as a juvenile. As an adult, he was charged with a variety of crimes including possession of counterfeit money, loitering, burglary, kidnapping, and armed robbery. He was also accused of masturbating while peeping through a woman's window. In one incident, Chandler and an accomplice broke into a Florida couple's home, held them at gunpoint, and robbed them. Chandler told his accomplice to tie up the man with a speaker wire and took the woman into the bedroom, where he made her strip to her underwear, tied her up, and rubbed the barrel of his revolver across her stomach. Courtney Campbell Causeway, from the Clearwater side of the bridge where the bodies were found. On the 26th of May 1989, Jo Rogers, 36, and her daughters Michelle, 17, and Christine, 14, left their family dairy farm in Wilshire, Ohio for a vacation in Florida. It was the first time they had left their home state. Authorities believe Joan became lost on the 1st of June during their return drive from Orlando to Wilshire, and they decided to take an extra vacation day in Tampa. While looking for the hotel, they encountered Chandler, who gave them directions and offered to meet them again and take them on a sunset cruise of Tampa Bay. Joan and her teenage daughters had left Orlando at around 9 a.m. and checked into the Days Inn on Route 60 at 12:30 p.m. Photographs retrieved from a roll of film found in the camera in the Rogers hotel room showed Michelle sitting on the floor. The last photograph was taken from the hotel balcony and showed the sun beginning to set over Tampa Bay, confirming that all three family members were alive and had not left their hotel room as sunset began. They were last seen alive at the hotel's restaurant at around 7:30 p.m. It is believed that they boarded Chandler's boat by the dock on the Courtney Campbell Causeway, part of Route 60, between 8:30 p.m. and 9 p.m, and that they were unalived by 3 a.m. the next day. Chandler may have used the fact that he was born in Ohio to lure them into feeling a connection with them. Chandler knew Joan and her daughters were not from Florida because he saw the Ohio license plates on their car. Sunshine Skyway over Tampa Bay, where the first body was found on the 4th of June 1989. Their bodies were found floating in Tampa Bay on the 4th of June 1989. The first body was found when several people on board a sailboat crossing under the Sunshine Skyway saw an object in the water. The second body was seen floating off the pier in St. Petersburg, 2 miles north of the first. While the Coast Guard was recovering the second body, a call about the third, which was seen floating 200 yards to the east, was received. All three female bodies were found floating face down, bound with a rope around the neck and naked below the waist. Autopsies of all of them showed that they had water in their lungs, proving they had been thrown in the water while still alive. Michelle, who was identified as the second body found, had freed one hand from her bounds before she drowned. The partially dressed state of the three bodies indicated the underlying crime was SA. Ropes with a concrete block at the other end had been tied around their necks to ensure that they unalived from either suffocation or drowning, and that their bodies would never be found. The bodies, however, bloated as a result of decomposition and floated to the surface. One of the body bags used at the scene on the 4th of June 1989. The Rogers bodies underwent decomposition whilst underwater due to hot weather. Because of this, they weren't identified for a week after the remains were located. Joan Rogers and her daughters were not positively identified until a week after their bodies' discovery, by which time Joan's husband and the girl's father, Hal Rogers, had reported them missing in Ohio. On the 8th of June, a housekeeper at the Days Inn said the Rogers family room had not been disturbed and the beds had not been slept in. The hotel manager contacted the police. Fingerprints found in the room were matched to the bodies, and final confirmation of their identities came from dental records. Marine researchers at the University of South Florida estimated from currents and patterns that the women were thrown from a boat and not from a bridge or dry land between 2 and 5 days before they were found. Their car, a 1984 Oldsmobile Calais with Ohio license plates, was found at the boat dock by the Courtney Campbell Causeway. The writing on the note written on Joan Rogers' map, which was used to identify Chandler as the unaliver. The case remained unsolved for over 3 years, partially due to the volume of tips received by police investigators. The biggest tip came from a Madeira Beach police bulletin that described a similar R of a 24-year-old Canadian tourist that occurred 2 weeks before the Rogers unalivings. Chandler was arrested for the unalivings on the 24th of September 1992. His handwritten directions on a brochure found in the Rogers' vehicle and a description of his boat, written by Joe Rogers on the brochure, were the primary clues that led him being named as a suspect. Local police posted images of Chandler's handwriting on a brochure on billboards in the Tampa Bay area, leading to a call from his former neighbour who provided a copy of a work order Chandler had written. This use of billboards by law enforcement in the US was unusual at the time. Through handwriting analysis, the two samples were matched. A palm print on the brochure was also matched to Chandler, who had sold his boat and left town with his family soon after the billboards appeared. Police reported that Chandler and his then wife moved from their home in Dalton Avenue in Tampa to Port Orange near Daytona Beach. Investigators originally thought that 2 men were involved in the unalivings of the Rogers family. This theory was used for a reenactment shown in the 1991 episode of Unsolved Mysteries. This theory was dismissed when Chandler was arrested. No evidence of a second man, other than a former prison cellmate's claim that Chandler said another man, whose identity the cellmate claimed to know but would not reveal, has ever surfaced. The second suspect theory was dismissed by Chandler's approach of 2 Canadian female tourists that he was willing to approach multiple targets by himself. Hal Rogers' brother, John, was also considered a suspect, even though he was serving a prison sentence for the art of a woman at the time of the unalivings. Police investigating the woman's art allegation found evidence indicating John had also essayed Hal's daughter Michelle, although charges involving this assault were later dropped because of her reluctance to testify. The St. Petersburg Times said John may have planned the unaliving during a visit to his parents' property near Tampa a month before the unalivings. Once the police established John couldn't have hired a contact unaliver, didn't have accomplices, and could not have known the timing of his sister-in-law's and niece's trip, he was dismissed as a suspect. Hal was also considered a suspect because he had posted the bail for his brother, but he stated in an episode of On the Case with Paul Azan that he posted bail prior to knowing his brother had abused Michelle. Hal later said that he promised the family that he would post bail and would not renege on his promise. Investigators from Florida and Ohio also discovered Hal had withdrawn $7,000 from his bank account at the time of disappearance, which he was able to account for. He had planned to use it to look for his wife and daughters before he was notified of their passings. Investigators proved conclusively that Hal had not left Ohio during that period. The assaults of Michelle Rogers by her uncle and the gossip by local people was one of the reasons for the Florida trip. Joan and her daughters want to distance themselves from the incident. At his trial in Clearwater, Florida, Chandler said that he met Joan, Michelle and Christine Rogers and gave them directions but never saw them again except in newspaper coverage and on billboards. He acknowledged he was in Tampa Bay that night. The police had evidence of 3 ship-to-shore telephone calls made from his boat to his home during the time frame of the unalivings, but Chandler maintained that he was fishing alone. He said that he'd returned home late because his engine wouldn't start, which he attributed to a gas line leak. He also said that he'd called the Coast Guard and the Florida Marine Patrol and had flagged down a patrol boat, but both were too busy to help. He said he subsequently fixed the line with duct tape and returned safely to shore. However, there were no records of distress calls from Chandler to either the Coast Guard or Marine Patrol that night, nor were there any Coast Guard boats on the bay the following morning that would have helped him. According to a boat mechanic who testified for the prosecution, Chandler's explanation for repairing the boat's alleged gas leak was not tenable because the fuel lines on his boat, a bayliner, were directed upward. This meant that a leak would have sprayed fuel into the air rather than into the boat, and the gasoline would have dissolved the adhesive of the duct tape Chandler maintained he had used to repair a leak. Under questioning from Pinellas County Prosecutor Douglas Crowe, Chandler said that he couldn't remember. A woman named Judy Blair testified that on the 15th of May 1989, 2 weeks before the Rogers murders, Chandler invited her onto his boat in nearby Madeira Beach for a boat trip on Tampa Bay, aired her and returned her to shore. Blair had been with her friend Barbara Mottram, who refused Chandler's offer to join them on the boat. After Blair was aired, she told the court that she returned to her hotel room where Mottram was waiting. Chandler wasn't charged with this crime initially because his identity wasn't known, and after the murder trial to prevent Blair from having to recount the ordeal again. Blair testified during Chandler's murder trial to help establish the pattern of attack and shown similarities between the two crimes. Blair stated that Chandler, on the 14th of May, had given his name as Dave Posner or Dave Posno when the three first met at a convenience store in Tampa. He told Blair and Mottram that he was in an aluminium siding contracting business, which later helped lead investigators to him. It also inspired the name of the investigation, Operation Tin Man. The facial composite produced by Blair's description was posted on the billboards along with handwriting samples. A former employee of Chandler's testified that he bragged about dating 3 women on the bay the night of the murders, and the next morning he arrived by boat and delivered materials for a job and immediately set out again. In an attempt to establish Chandler's whereabouts on the night, investigators found records to several ship-to-shore phone calls made from his boat to his home between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m, which may have been attempts to explain his absence to his wife and provide himself with an alibi at the time of the murders. His daughter Crystal Sue Mayers testified that her father had talked about killing 3 women and he was afraid to return to Tampa. Her husband Rick testified that he didn't recall the conversation, but did remember that Chandler admitted to hiring women in the Madeira Beach area and said that one of them A woman who worked as a maid at the Days Inn said she walked past Chandler on the 1st of June as she was going to the Rogers room for room service. She said she didn't realise the significance of this sighting until Chandler's arrest in 1992. This sighting has never been confirmed. Michelle Rogers' boyfriend and Hal Rogers also gave evidence during the trial. Joan, Michelle and Christine Rogers were buried in their hometown on the 13th of June 1989 after a funeral service attended by around 300 family members and friends. Numerous police officers were present to keep reporters and television crews out of the church during the service. Chandler was found guilty of the murders and sentenced to death on the 4th of November 1994. He maintained his innocence and continued to pursue legal appeals while on Florida's death row. He admitted to the Madeira Beach incident but said that the S was consensual and that the victim had changed her mind during the act. Because Chandler had already been sentenced to death for the Rogers' murders and because prosecutors didn't want to subject Blair to emotional trauma of the R trial, he was never prosecuted for her R-ing. Chandler awaited execution of a sentence at the Union Correctional Institution. Shortly after his trial and conviction, his wife Deborah filed for divorce and the marriage was dissolved a year later. Chandler was no longer allowed to see his daughter Whitney, and in accordance with his ex-wife's wishes, he wasn't allowed to see photographs of her. In July 2008, Chandler was on Florida's short list of executions. Profiling experts speculated that Chandler may have killed previously, based on the belief that a first-time killer wouldn't be experienced or bold enough to abduct and kill 3 women at once. Chandler remained a suspect in the 1982 murder of a woman whose body was found floating off Anna Maria Island until 2011, when the body was identified as 29-year-old Amy Hurst and her husband William was arrested and charged with her murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison on the 4th of April 2011. Chandler was never charged with another murder. All his appeals of his 1994 conviction were denied. His last was in May 2007. After his conviction, Chandler was named by the media as one of Florida's most notorious criminals. He said his last words before his execution would be, in May 2011, comparisons were drawn between Chandler's case and the trial in 1994 with the murder case of Kaylee Anthony. Both cases, heightened media attention forced the selection of jurors who lived outside the county where the crime had been committed. One of the jurors in Chandler's 1994 trial said, Judge Susan F. Schaefer, who presided over the 1994 trial and ultimately sentenced Chandler, described him in a 2011 interview as, she said, on the 10th of October 2011, Governor Rick Scott signed Chandler's death warrant. His execution was set for the 15th of November 2011 at 4 p.m. His lawyer, Bear Harrison, said Chandler asked him not to file any frivolous appeals to keep him alive. Harrison said, Harrison also said that Chandler suffered from high blood pressure, coronary artery disease, problems with his kidneys, and arthritis. On the 12th of October 2011, Harrison said that although he was preparing to file a motion regarding the violation of his client's 5th and 14th Amendment rights in the case, he was unsure whether Chandler was willing to travel to Clearwater for the court hearing or would agree to the filing of the motion. Harrison said. On the 18th of October, Harrison filed a motion against the execution on the grounds that the way Florida imposes the death penalty is unconstitutional. A jury may recommend a life sentence or death sentence, but under Florida law, the judge makes the final decision. A hearing for Chandler's motion was set for the 21st of October at 1 p.m. Chandler didn't attend. On the 24th of October, his appeal was rejected because he had already filed an appeal to the Florida Supreme Court prior to the decision. Although the Florida Supreme Court initially scheduled Chandler's appeal to be heard on the 9th of November 2011, they later cancelled oral argument. On the 7th of November 2011, the Florida Supreme Court denied his appeal for his death sentences and death warrant. The Florida Supreme Court had upheld his death sentence in 1997 and 2003. His subsequent petition to the United States Supreme Court was also denied. On the 15th of November at 4:08 p.m., he was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Railford. He declined to make a last statement before being executed, but left a written statement with prison officials. Shortly after signing Chandler's death warrant, Governor Scott said, Chandler's daughter, Valerie Troxell, said in an interview after the execution, she also said that she sent a letter to Governor Scott asking him to commute Chandler's sentence to life imprisonment. Chandler's son Jeff said, after his execution, Chandler was described as he didn't receive a single visitor during his years in Florida's death row unit. Another of Chandler's daughters, Suzette, said her father was a monster who got what he deserved. On the 25th of February 2014, investigators revealed that DNA evidence identified Chandler as the murderer of 20-year-old Evilise Berrios Bergeris, who was hard and strangled in Coral Springs, Florida on the 27th of November 1990. Berrios Bergeris, a 20-year-old newlywed, was last seen at Sawgrass Mills Mall, where she'd worked as a sporting goods store. When she didn't return home, her husband went to the mall and found her car, a 1985 Ford Tempo, with the tyres slashed. It is believed Chandler, after watching her for 2 days slash the tyres, arrived in the guise of a helpful stranger and offered to help. 3 hours after she was reported missing, her body was found under a residential mailbox in a local neighbourhood by 2 men returning from a fishing trip. Her body was naked and had ligature marks, and both wrists and legs had brown tape stuck to her hair. The case was considered solved and closed according to police. Law enforcement agencies across Florida investigated other cold cases in areas Chandler was known to have lived.